Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. In 1998, the seaside town of Selsey in Sussex, England, suffered a tornado, very rare for the UK. The tornado damaged 1,000 buildings and caused over £10 million worth of damage. To add insult to injury, the town was descended upon by rogue traders, taking advantage of people desperate to get their home repairs done. One local man, Kevin Byrne, was determined to protect his local community and set up a website where people could verify local tradespeople and read reviews of their previous work. We now know that website as Checkatrade. And today, it's my pleasure to be joined by the newish CEO of Checkatrade, Jambu Palaniappan, on what the future holds for this company and the UK tech sector. Jambu, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for having me on.
Fantastic. So, Jambu, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
I am a byproduct of really an incredible story, which is my parents are originally from India. They moved to the US in the late 70s to study. And I am really a byproduct of the classic kind of American immigrant story. My parents are both engineers. They both work in the tech industry. My mom's a software developer. Not many people can say that. My dad worked in semiconductors. In the classic American sense, they both still work, despite being of, I guess, retirement age. And I think for me, that experience of growing up in Silicon Valley, in the heart of the technology industry, and understanding the potential that, technology has to improve our lives and help drive humanity forward was really powerful. Where I think that really manifested itself was, what could technology do in offline industries or in the physical world? This wasn't just about like ethereal kind of photo sharing apps, right? This was about, how can technology add value to you and me and everyone else in ways that matter? And if you think about Checkatrade's story, it's actually similar, right? And this evolution out of real desperation and need that you highlighted in your intro, and how technology can really add value to home repairs and improvements, which are a massive part of everyone's lives. Homes are our most prized possession, very emotional in terms of our attachment to them, and there's a lot of similarities there.
Thank you for sharing your kind of background story, Jambu. And I think it would be fair to say that probably a few listeners are quite surprised when I've introduced the CEO of Checkatrade, a very British kind of startup, and then they hear this American voice, and you're kind of born and bred in Silicon Valley, and you've got a background at Uber. What brought you to the UK and to our humble Checkatrade?
I joined Uber very early on. Uber was about 70 employees when I joined in San Francisco in 2012. I really, really believed in the power of Uber to be a globally relevant business, and that was a big part of my motivation for joining. My first 52 weeks at Uber, I traveled to 35 countries to help figure out what Uber's international operating model would be, and was really fortunate to have had that experience at quite a young age. I think I was 24 when it happened. And the main focus of that period was really understanding how that technology could actually be applied outside of Silicon Valley, outside of the US, in Europe, but also in emerging markets, in Latin America, in Indonesia, and how would a product have to localize and internationalize to be effective. That was supposed to be an 18-month assignment for me, which was help figure out what the international operating model could be. And that was 12 years ago now. And I haven't really gone back since. I think the reasons for that are, one, I'm a huge believer in the idea of, I think what unites us is really great and powerful and influential, and it's far greater than kind of what divides societies or countries, right? And I think actually technology is a really great equalizer there, because it's not about, where you went to school or, where your family comes from. It's about the quality of the product that you can build. So for me, at the end of my experience with Uber, I kind of stayed. I would be lying if I told you that it also didn't have to do with my wife, who's English.
The real answer, Jambu.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
I see. Yeah.
But it's been a great opportunity to work and to bring, whether it was at Uber, I had a career as a venture capitalist investing in software companies, to really help figure out how the UK and Europe can be a real spot for innovation and growth. And I think that's really possible. And I think for me, Checkatrade was the next evolution of that story, right? Which is this company that has delivered so much value to consumers and to trade members, a large part of the British economy, and an opportunity to help consumers and trades with the next evolution of what the product could be. I'm also very reminded every morning when I wake up and my two daughters, who are 4 and 2, sort of come at me with English accent. I sort of have this bizarre moment of, hey, how did this happen? But no, it's great. I think that it's a real reflection of the modern world.
I'm going to be a bit cruel now, and it's only because I've heard the story when we met before, but you've mentioned your wife. Would you mind sharing your engagement story with your wife? Because I think it's quite important context for all our listeners.
Oh gosh, this maybe get me in trouble, but it's a good story. So my wife and I, we both worked together at Uber, didn't report to each other or anything like that, but we were peers. And at the end of Uber, when we both left, we went on a trip. We went to Australia, New Zealand. I was at that point kind of at the place of proposing or considering proposing. So I had a ring, and we ended up in Sydney, and I was walking around with the ring in my pocket trying to figure out the right time to propose. What ended up happening when I was in Australia was I ended up getting these asthma attacks quite regularly. And I was a bit unsure why, because I hadn't had an asthma attack since I was 4 years old. Really severe, like real difficulty breathing. It's not a great situation.
Yeah.
And
not exactly romantic either.
Yeah. And I later found out that it's quite common for folks when they go to Australia because the flora and fauna in Australia is so different. It turns out for me, it was related to eating oysters, eating quite a lot of oysters, and as a protein in the oyster shell that I apparently am allergic to. But what ended up happening was I didn't propose to her during that trip because every time I thought about proposing, I effectively had an asthma attack, which I chalked up to anxiety or nerves, which in fact had to do more with oysters and being allergic to, I guess, Australia. But the joke that I have is the only thing worse than flying 24 hours home from Australia is flying 24 hours home from Australia, sitting next to somebody who's not talking to you because you didn't propose.
Absolutely. I'd love that it was oysters as well, which are meant to be, romantic. Aphrodisiac, the exact opposite. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. You have good experience with failure, Jambu, which I know that all leaders often point to, that, getting comfortable with failure is very important.
Yeah, resilience.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it all worked out well in the end. As an adult, do you think you've become more or less radical, and what's been behind that?
I think definitely more. And I think there's 2 principles that have driven why. One is, especially after becoming a father, I think what I've realized is time is super finite and I don't want to waste time. That's probably my biggest fear, is wasting time and feeling like I haven't used that day, that week, that month, that year effectively. And I really enjoyed my career as a venture capitalist. It was a really interesting intellectual exercise, and it was amazing to work with such inspirational founders as they were at these really critical stages of building their business. But I kept having these moments of kind of going, well, what would happen if I just disappeared? And I think the honest answer is probably not that much, because it was effectively, being paid to make, 2, 3 really high quality decisions a year. And the rest of it was a bit just stale. And that is really acute now. And I think one of the things I encourage with my team is really just folks take stock of how they're spending their time. And are you working on the areas that will have the highest impact? I think the second thing for me is one of the things that holds individuals back, holds companies back, holds societies back is actually being too narrow or limited in their ambition. And I think, that is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If all you're trying to do is be 2% better or 5% better, what are you going to do? You're just going to sort of, raise your prices every year and do nothing else, right? And for me, I think this is really about asking the question of how do you actually create more value? And if you create more value, you'll benefit from it operationally, you'll benefit from it financially, your customers will benefit from it. But I think that ambition and asking yourself, like, how does this actually get 10 times better? How does this get 100 times better? How do we create and capture much more value for our customers? I think that is really where my thinking has changed. And if you think, Checkatrade is a good example, right? We've recently rolled out a new tool to help our trade members manage quotes and invoices. And a lot of people said, well, why would you do that, right? They have accounting software and QuickBooks and things like that to actually do that. But actually what we found is that there's been huge interest in demand from our trade members in value and using Checkatrade beyond just generating leads. And I think that is an example of where ambition and being a little bit radical in terms of your evolution as a business is really critical to getting there. And I think, if anything, I think we just have to be okay with a little bit more risk tolerance, a little bit more failure, a little bit more ambiguity. When I talk to students, one of the questions they always ask me is they say, what skill do you think is most important, whether it's working in a startup or in life? And I always say, for me, it's comfort with ambiguity, right? It's something that I think we as a society aren't great at the moment. And I think being comfortable with ambiguity actually get you really far because you're okay with some of the unknown.
Really interesting. Yeah. There's a couple of things in my mind. First of all, thinking about the simplification that you're trying to offer with the product. This is real recency bias, but my God, I get so annoyed having to use 3 different platforms just to log into a particular, piece of software. I've got my password manager over here, but it didn't link properly with my Chrome, with my, whatever. So Jambu, let's talk about work now. You've mentioned a lot about work already, but take us into Checkatrade right now. We had the intro kind of story, the history of it. It's been around in the UK for a long time now. What does the future hold for Checkatrade and what challenges are you facing?
For Checkatrade right now, our main focus is how can we provide more value to consumers and to trades. If you think about how the home improvement and repair sector is evolving, there is so much opportunity, right? And one of the interesting things about Checkatrade right now is that we already in a position where we have a choice about which of those opportunities to pursue. And so a big part of how I've spent my time is thinking about where we prioritize. And I think really what you've seen and what you will see from us is 3 real areas of focus and growth. I think the first is the shift in how consumers interact with our platform. So historically, we've had 2 kind of ways that consumers interact with Checkatrade and our trade members. One has been a paper directory business. So that's actually what was started in 1998, originally pre-web, where vetted, trusted trades locally advertised in local towns and cities. In Portsmouth or in Wandsworth, you would have a local directory, which would have, 50 vetted and trusted trades across a variety of categories. And then the second area has been our website, right? And that website has been where consumers have come to search for and match trades. But we also know that technology is evolving and consumer needs are evolving, and we need a consumer app platform to really drive the best quality of experience, the best communication, the avoiding having to log into 3 apps to manage a job problem that you just highlighted. So the first big focus for us is a consumer app platform that will allow consumers to really manage their homes and an end-to-end journey where you can search, plan, get quotes, find pricing, communicate with trades, and eventually pay as well. And imagine a world where when you move into a house or you move into a flat, you have a checklist of things you should do. Or if you're a renter, not an owner, you have a way to communicate with your landlord as well about what needs to be done. And so there's a lot we can do once we have that consumer platform up and running. I'm really proud of our team. We went from a standing start in December to a fully launched consumer app in June, which is an unheard of timeline, but I think also proves the value once you really get behind something. The second area of focus is right now our trade members, about 50,000 of them across Britain. They rely on us for leads, right? So that's leads for jobs that happen on the platform. But it's also very clear that that needs to evolve. The information that comes through in those leads needs to improve to include things like photos or information about the home or information about materials that are needed to do the job. We know that there's a lot of interest in helping to find subcontractors to help support some of the work that they need to do. And we also know that there's value that our trade members are asking for beyond just leads, which is what we did today. So there's a big opportunity to really build a platform to help trade members grow their business and also attract new trades to the industry. We know there's a really acute trade shortage here in Britain. And then I think the third area that you'll see a lot of focus from us on is around how we think about the payment for jobs, because we know that one of the things that gives consumers peace of mind with Checkatrade is the Checkatrade guarantee. So this is a £1,000 guarantee for every job booked on the platform. How does that evolve over time to support consumers and trades in many more opportunities and sort of experiences? So would say the majority of areas that we're focused on fall into one of those three. There's obviously a lot to do and a long to-do list, sometimes also a not to-do list, but, really proud of the team for the progress we've made. I've only been at Checkatrade now 11 months and already see really just an amazing shift in ambition, as I mentioned.
It's an amazing list of programs and a real transformation, and very exciting, Jambu. And it makes me think about how you approach this as a leader and your kind of leadership ethos. And I'm going to flatter you now. You seem like you're quite a young leader, say quite a young CEO as they go. Would that be fair?
Oh man, I don't know. It doesn't always feel like it.
Is there a very old head on young shoulders, maybe? How do you approach going into a company quite fresh? I imagine you have quite a different background and work experience to a lot of the people that were in your team and the team you were inherited. What do you fall back on in how you lead this team in delivering this huge program of work?
Yeah, I think the first thing I always start with is the foundations of Checkatrade are so strong, right? The history, the commitment to trust and quality, the real low ego, high empathy culture that was here is really unique and I think really important in terms of a group of individuals that have really been open-minded to an evolution and change. For me, it's also about helping to communicate what the ambition is, and the ambition being much larger. That ambition being to create much more value for consumers and to create much more value for our trade members. And what I've always seen is when you can do that well, you can really get a team on board with that opportunity. And there have been so many examples of people in our team, Katrina, who leads our directories business, or Jade, who leads our member vetting team, who've been at Checkatrade for 5, 7, 10 years and have really embraced the opportunities to grow. And I think one of my core principles is I think all of us have a capacity to lead that is far greater than our experience suggests. And we just need somebody to push, right? I was 26 at Uber running $1 billion P&L, right? I was not qualified to do that, but I learned, and I had people who really supported me through that journey. And I learned that my capacity was greater than my experience. And that's kind of what I believe really fundamentally. So I'm really proud of the team here for how they've embraced that and how that's evolved. I've also, obviously, folks have joined us to support in that journey, right? And they are marketplace experts, people who really understand how businesses like this should evolve. They come from companies like Trainline and Bumble and Just Eat, and that is really helpful in the evolution of our thinking to do that. So I think that's number one, is this idea that capacity is far greater than experience, and you have to really embrace, the culture that exists while also being really, just direct about where it needs to evolve. I'm a big believer in radical candor as a principle. Sometimes it gets me in trouble, but I think, ruinous empathy is one of the things that just destroys businesses. And then the third thing I would say is I'm obsessed with the principle of effective decision-making. You'd be amazed at how many times in business situations, actually the lack of delivery is really around lack of clarity of who's the owner of a decision. And human nature is to try to delegate, to try to create multiple owners. And I think finding this idea of how do we get to clarity of who's the owner and who owns the decision, trusting that person, really having a high bar will get you far. So those are just some of the things, that I've learned. I think personally, there's one more thing that I've learned, which is I think you have to be okay in this job or any job, a leadership job, where you have to be okay with your to-do list being a bit incomplete, right? I was one of those type A people, had to get through my to-do list every day. I had to get to inbox 0 every day. And you kind of go crazy if that's the approach you take in a situation like this. One of my promises, one of the reasons I actually took this job was in my last job, I was traveling a lot internationally to Toronto, San Francisco, Singapore. And I had young kids. I felt like I wasn't seeing them much. And when I came back, I was really tired. And I think one of the things that I really encourage everybody to do is to make sure they find energy outside of work. Because I think if you don't, you'll be in the situation where you will just go in spirals in yourself. So I think finding that outlet, whether it's music, art, sports, your family, whatever it may be, is really critical.
What is your outlet?
I'm pretty religious about the fitness at the moment. I would say at the end of Uber, I was really not in a good spot health-wise, both fitness and nutrition. That was 5 years ago. So now I'm pretty regimented on that, probably at least 3 days, usually 4 days in the gym a week. And I also play tennis. And the tennis I find really interesting because one of the challenges with the gym is your brain starts thinking about work because that's how your brain works. Whereas the tennis, you literally have to focus so deeply on the tennis that if you don't, you're not actually effective. So I found that to be helpful as well. I also really make sure that an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening with my kids is no phone, entire focus with them. That's always good fun. My older daughter right now is obsessed with the idea of camping. And so we spend a lot of time talking about camping and thinking about where she would go camping. I think she doesn't fully realize the consequences of that.
I'm just imagining you at sort of 7 a.m. out in your garden in big camping with your daughter. So I think that's a really good lesson. I think of it like a graphic equalizer. Like I have all these channels on my life and you can dial some of them up and dial some of them down, but you don't want any of them to be fully down or fully up. You know, work is only one part of your life. If there's nothing coming from any other channels, then you're going to be expecting, you know, some overperformance from somewhere and relying too much on something. And, you know, work can't give you your whole sense of self and your whole happiness. It's a really important lesson to learn. I was also thinking about our CEO, Susanna, who's a very, very good squash player when you were talking about tennis as well. So yeah, she's part of this CEO club where we're all very, very sporty. Jambu, let's turn our gaze a bit wider now to the UK and sort of the UK tech sector. This is an area that you're quite passionate about and have a lot of thoughts about. Would it be fair to say, like, I think we've always been the much poorer cousin of the US when it comes to technology? Well, I think this is the best summary of it. We have a Silicon Roundabout where the US has a Silicon Valley, right? But how do you feel about UK tech? Are you optimistic, or do you think we have some real problems coming up?
No, I'm very optimistic. I think there's a couple of things that really make a difference, right? One is there is a real shift in focus towards entrepreneurship and technology, right? So I, for the last couple of years, mentored some students at a school in East London. And what was amazing over those years that I did that was the evolution in their thinking around their ambition. And I think they went from a mindset of like being a banker was the pinnacle of success to entrepreneurship, technology, and starting businesses, even if they're not technology businesses, was really their focus, because I think more than anything, it gave them control over their own destiny. So that was really great to see. I think the second thing is there is really an amazing education system here, right? And I think whether it's secondary school or universities or apprenticeships or trade training, there is a great culture of training here. I think my question is what happens after the training? And there is something that happens that makes people risk averse in terms of professional ambition. And my sort of anthropological assessment, I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with it, but that's fine, is there's two things. One is, I think we have to be more supportive of failure and be more accepting of failure versus beating people down when they fail, right? As long as the failure is not immoral or unethical, I think you should actually celebrate ambition, particularly in business, particularly where people took risks and tried to build. And if they didn't, they didn't. And we move on and we celebrate them forward and they go do the next thing. Versus what it feels like, which is failure really hanging over everybody and, really wanting to celebrate somebody else's downfall. And that, I think, is not healthy or effective. And I think the second thing for me is helping people understand that there's quite a lot of access to capital now in the UK, right? It's not necessarily that, especially at the early stages. I think for me, it is helping people understand that how you run and build an early stage business, that doesn't mean that you don't need to worry about the profitability of that business, right? And actually early stage entrepreneurship and supporting entrepreneurship and helping to really create an environment that educates, helps entrepreneurs thrive, I think that could be really effective. Because I think the UK is in this interesting spot at the moment, right? Which is, has the opportunity to use some of those advantages to drive innovation forward, and also just geographically, culturally, really aligned to a much more global opportunity and ambition than maybe just the US or maybe just Europe or maybe just Asia, for example. So I'm optimistic, but I think my view is I think those two things need to evolve a bit more.
Really interesting. I'm aware that what often happens in the UK is a kind of, I'd call it a sort of sell the family silver strategy, which is we build something or we have something precious and then we quite quickly sell it, rather than kind of go through some tougher times and then grow it into a really large business. We're thinking business specifically. I can't remember the stats exactly, but it's a huge percentage of UK startups will exit, quite early and will not stay the course and will not grow into these kind of larger, more substantial businesses. Do you see that? Am I accurate in my assessment? What's behind that? Do you think it's linked to this risk aversion piece? What do you think's behind that?
Well, I think a mid-market or low-scale sale could make a ton of sense, but you need a capital structure that reflects that, right? What you can't do is go raise a bunch of money on the promise of a better tomorrow and then go sell for less, right? That doesn't work for anybody. And I think one of my questions when I was a venture capitalist was, is this company actually a venture capital sort of business? Or should this just be somebody who raises a small amount of money in a more traditional finance vehicle and exits for a smaller amount of money and makes a good return for their investors and a good return for the founders, but is not reflective of a 30 times forward revenue multiple for a business that's delivering ice cream to people's homes, right? Like, you say that now, and that makes a lot of logical sense. But in 2021, I think 5 companies raised on that premise, right? So to me, that is part of it, which is the capital structure actually reflect the kinds of businesses that it is, and how do angel investors, banks, government grants, whatever it is, support that structure. I think the other piece is the smart technical and engineering talent actually going into entrepreneurship and building versus into finance, right? Or versus into just big tech.
So you mentioned that you've mentored kids in East London school. You're a father now. When you told me about the kids you were mentoring and this risk aversion that they naturally had, it reminded me of a story that a friend of mine who's a drama teacher at a very elite private school told me, which is, he was going in with his students and saying, this year, all I want you to do is fail. He noticed the same thing, the same sort of anxiety. There is a feeling that younger people today are more anxious. They're more to be anxious about. How are you approaching that with your own children? Obviously, they're very young. What are your thoughts about that with your own children and the kids that you mentor? How do we encourage young people to, I suppose it's take bigger risks, but it's not just about that, is it? It's just kind of to bet on themselves, believe in themselves more, understand what might be possible, understand that if you make a mistake, it's not necessarily the end of the world, Is this a uniquely British thing linked to what you were talking about before, where we kind of like to punch people when they're down? Have they absorbed that and they're just like, I don't want to go anywhere near that. I want to do something safe. What's your assessment of that whole thing?
Yeah, I don't think it's a uniquely British thing. I think it's also cultural, it feels like at the moment, right? Where we see a lot of people's successes and we don't see as much of their failures, whether it's social media or LinkedIn or, even how we talk about, the Olympics, right, as they're going on. And I think it's obviously important to celebrate success. And I think there's really no shortage of that, right? I don't think we need to sit here and say we need to celebrate more public success. I think if anything, we probably need to celebrate more private success. What I notice is the fear of failure is tied to 2 things. It's tied to perception of that failure, and it's tied to frustration on the process. And I think the perception of what is great and what is valued is something that we have the power to change. And how do we help somebody understand that being an entrepreneur, creating jobs, driving technology forward, being an example for what British tech can be? That is actually something that should be celebrated. And that is something that should be revered, and entrepreneurs should be revered in that same way. And that's not just about the businesses they create, but that's about the ecosystem that you can contribute to. And then I think the second is the frustration. I noticed this myself, right? Which is when you're not good at something, you get frustrated. You ask yourself, well, why should I keep doing it? For me, I think what I've realized is the satisfaction you get from overcoming that is really palpable and impactful. And I think there is a lot more we can do in society here in education to encourage that process, because that process of learning, which is actually a core part of how children learn, we sort of seem to lose as we get older. And I think that's something we can influence.
That's really interesting. And also we sort of forget how to play as well. So we forget how to live in the realm of the possible rather than in the cold light of day. I think that's good. And I think lifelong learning is a huge part of what can help you achieve whatever you're trying to achieve. Let's move out to the world now. And what's a little bit radical change for the world that you would like people to get behind if you could wave a magic wand?
I mean, I think the big thing for me is just to make it easier for people to start businesses and start companies and really support themselves in terms of control over their own destiny. we hear a lot in Britain right now about cost of living, right? Cost of living crisis and the cost of things going up. And there's a lot of people focused on how you can save a little bit of money. Here's how you can save £5 a month on your energy bill or on your mobile phone tariff. But we don't hear a lot about how you can augment your income, right? We don't hear a lot about how you can grow your earnings. We don't hear a lot about, what you can do to support that. And so I think for me, that is a really interesting question, which is how do we really help encourage people to take risks, grow, have more control over their own destiny? I'm a big believer in there is a role that we all have to play in that. There's a role that government has to play in that, but it's also not just going to be like done for you, right? You have to see that opportunity.
I'm thinking about when I see universities advertising themselves, they put these stats up. There's, 97% of graduates are employed 6 months after graduating. And I'm wondering what an interesting flip it would be if it was like 45% of graduates have started their own business, within 2 years or something like that. It's just not part of that same narrative. It's silly because there are so many people who have started their own business, but I think in the narrative around it, it's kind of like these weird people on the side who've started their own business. The rest of us are expected to work for a big company, and do your time.
Well, I think it's just society, right? I think it's risk, right? It's risk tolerance. You think about something as simple as like, it's hard to get a mortgage if you don't have a PAYE, right? So, things like that that sort of discourage it, or the business rate structure, which discourages it, right? So I think there is a lot we can do. It's just we have to be prepared to have those tough conversations. And I think tough conversations are just a bit difficult at the moment.
Well, Jambu, it's been fantastic to talk to you today. The last question is always the same, which is, and very appropriate given what we've just been talking about. If there's someone out there listening who has a little bit of a radical idea for their personal life or a business or whatever it might be, but they don't know where to get started, what would your advice be to them?
It would be to do two things. One is to write down the idea. And what I find is the distillation of writing it down and going deeper into why would it work? Why wouldn't it work? What's your concern? How would you do it? Writing brings clarity. And what I've learned is from some of the great entrepreneurs I know is as they go through this process of ideation, as they go deeper, they gain more conviction. And that's a test actually for if it's an idea they should pursue. The second thing I would say, and I think LinkedIn, Twitter, or X are probably the two best platforms for this, is you would be amazed at how responsive people will be if you ask a specific question, right? So I get a lot on LinkedIn and on Twitter from folks about, hey, do you have time for a coffee? Or, hey, can we just catch up? And that's obviously a bit tricky. I try to respond to everybody. But when somebody asks me a question about, hey, Jambu, I know you know a lot about marketplaces. I'm building a marketplace for nail technicians. How do you think I should deal with this problem? I actually get really excited and respond and met a founder doing that a couple of weeks ago in Birmingham. So I think I would be specific and take that one-page document, share it in public channels with people who would be relevant, and you'd be amazed at how positive a response you'd get. And I think the idea behind that ideation phase is about building conviction for yourself in, is this an idea I should go pursue?
I think that's great advice. And actually, we've had both of those two mentioned by lots of our other guests, actually. And I like to remind people of conquering the fear of sharing the idea, because I think there's a complete myth around kind of keeping ideas secret and under lock and key, and someone will steal the idea. That doesn't really happen, right? It's all in the execution. Ideas are cheap, execution is everything. That's what I say. But in sharing it, you will learn more about it, and then you can have more conviction, like you say.
That's right.
Lovely. Well, Jambu, thank you so much for meeting us today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical, or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com, or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much, and speak to you next time.